Hello and welcome to this Year 8 webinar for descriptive writing. Now, there are three key learning aims, three key takeaways. First of all, engaging readers in descriptive writing using sensory description. Secondly, using descriptive techniques. And then finally, understanding the box method to structure descriptive writing. Now, all of this is centered around a specific writing assignment: describe a crime scene. So we'll have a picture as inspiration, and we'll be looking at sensory description, descriptive techniques, the box method to really help us to describe this crime scene. So the first thing is the picture. Here's the picture for the crime scene. It's definitely not too gory, and with any descriptive piece and with any picture that you're given to stimulate you into description, you need to add imagination. You really need to imagine yourself in that scene and imagine the characters. But first, you also need to decide which perspective you're describing from. Are you describing from first person narrative perspective? I had feared the worst, and the worst had happened. I could see everything. Although I had been shaken, I felt like a can of Coke, and an angry confidence exploded inside me. So is it from a first person perspective, someone at that crime scene, possibly this crime scene investigator there in the crime scene? Or is it from a third person perspective, an omniscient narrator, which means that they can see everything and hear everything? They're in lots of different conversations. They can see the future and the past, and they are all-knowing or omniscient. So they would say behind them, above her, in the distance, what they couldn't see yesterday, tomorrow, because they're omniscient. So you get to decide. You add imagination, imagine what's in the crime scene, and you get to decide if you're going to be writing in first person narrative perspective or third person omniscient narrative perspective. Today we're going to be using first person, but when you write this on your own, you can obviously use third person. First thing we're looking at then is sensory description, describing through the five senses, because this is how we make sense of the world. And we're using slightly more accurate subject terminology. So when you're describing things that you can hear, we call that auditory description. So you might write about things that tinkle or scratch or thunder and thump or thud or buzz and clank at this crime scene. It may well be full of lots of people. It might be very busy. And therefore, there are all sorts of different actions and gadgets and clocks and watches and phones that are making all sorts of noises. Then you also would be thinking about what you can see, visual description. Things might be shiny and glossy and emerald and red. They might be smudged or misty or colourless or dull. And also shape and size, rectangular and colossal, would be part of that visual description to describe this crime scene. What about things that you can touch? Again, maybe the narrator is omniscient, or the first person perspective is touching things that are spiky or hot or wet or bumpy or rough or jagged or gritty or slimy. Maybe they're velvety and smooth. Maybe they're powdery. So tactile description would definitely be a part of this. Now, taste and smell are the last two senses, and they're very often intertwined. If the character isn't actually eating something, sometimes when they smell it, it's almost as if they're eating it. So taste, gustatory description: tangy, salty, sour, peppery, lemony, minty, fruity, spicy, is very linked with the sense of smell. Olfactory description: musty, stale, floral, smoky, rotten, tangy, and lemony. So make sure that in your description for the crime scene, you're really thinking about the five senses: auditory, visual, tactile, gustatory, and olfactory description in your writing. So here, you also need to think, is it something that's really pleasant? Is it a pleasant sound? Or is it a really harsh and unpleasant sound or sight or taste or touch or smell? So is it repulsion that you're describing, something that's repulsive or very unpleasant and not very nice? Or is it attraction, something that is pleasant? So you need to describe if the sense is being repulsed or attracted by these different aspects. So here is an example of sensory description. Again, we don't want to be too gory in our description of this crime scene. So I've written something like this: the grubby, leaf-strewn pavement yawned ahead of me as I champed and crunched my way towards the shiny vanilla markers, crushing the jagged palm-like leaves beneath my muddy boots. As I slipped on the flimsy, rubbery shoe covers, I noticed a distinct odour of rotting flesh and an almost peppery tang. Cobalt rubber gloves coated my fingers in a warm, powdery substance that seemed to wriggle underneath my sharp fingernails. So you can see in that example, there are words that appeal or actually repel our sense of touch, like grubby, and our sense of smell, like rotting and peppery, our sense of touch, like powdery, and our sense of sound, like champing and crunching. So there's a sense that we're trying to appeal to lots of different senses all in one paragraph. Now, we really need to think about description that is trying to be clever. We're really thinking about implicit or indirect description that is show, don't tell. Now, we can't skip over this for description because it's really important. Now, when you're describing something explicitly, you're telling what is happening. She was feeling incredibly nervous. But when you're implicit description, you're showing, that means you're really describing in some detail how she is nervous. Her frail hands are shaking and trembling. Her entire body is consumed with uncontrollable shivering. So show, don't tell is a very important descriptive technique for your crime scene description. So, for example, what would this look like? So instead of saying that the scene was horrible, that's just telling. You would say something like, no one could look at the scene. All eyes were instantly averted, and even experienced officers went pale and looked away. So you can see something so horrible that no one can look at it. Instead of saying explicitly, blood was everywhere, there was blood everywhere. So that's just telling. You would say something like, red splotches stained the pavement, crimson whirls were splattered on the curb, dried scarlet blobs speckled the concrete, and even the grass was tinged with pink. So can you see with that description, it's implicit. It's not saying there was blood everywhere, but it's different kinds of red, crimson, scarlet, pink. And it's showing that it was on the pavement, it was on the curb, it was on the concrete, even the grass, it was everywhere. But you're really describing and showing rather than just telling. And then a dead body lay in the street. So instead of just telling, you're really showing, adding that detail. Swollen and bruised toes poked awkwardly out of a battered shoe. A blooded knee jutted at an impossible angle. Long matted locks wrapped a bruised neck like a hairy scarf. Two black eyes stared impassively, but not seeing. So again, it's not explicitly gory, but it is a brutal description because you've got the bruised toes, the battered shoes, the jutting knee at an impossible angle, the locks that are like the scarf, the two eyes. It's really gruesome, but it's not telling us it's a dead body in the street. It's showing through more detail and description. Other descriptive techniques that are really important to use for your crime scene description are AAA. So AAA stands for adjective, adverb, and alliteration. So let's quickly recap what these are. An adjective is a word that describes a noun, so happy, happy girl, grey, grey wall. An adverb gives information about a verb, quickly, very, very quickly. And alliterations have the same sounds at the start of words. Peter Piper picked a peck of peppers. So these AAA energize your writing. Instead of just talking about a wall or a girl or a shoe, you're adding those adjectives in front of them. You're adding the adverbs about how it was done and giving alliteration to make it more memorable. Now, another really important descriptive technique is figurative language. Another way of remembering this is Mopes. So you could use metaphor, onomatopoeia, personification, exaggeration, and simile. So a metaphor is presenting something as something else. So he is a gorilla. So this person is being presented as a gorilla, kind of direct comparison, almost transformation. Onomatopoeia are those sound effects words like crunch and crush, as we had earlier. Personification is giving it human qualities, and exaggeration is hyperbole, really going over the top. And simile is presenting something, comparison, but this time, not unlike the metaphor, using like or as. So let's think about some examples in your crime scene description. Here, again, you're using first person at this point with precise, delicate hands and eager eyes. I examine the evidence in disbelief, firmly, with stony fingers gripped. My stony fingers grip the gravelly object as if it were the most precious item in the world. So you can see here adjectives like precious and delicate and stony and precise. You've got the alliteration, eager eyes and gripped gravelly, and then you've got adverbs like in disbelief and firmly to really add detail and to energize that description with AAA. What about Mopes then? How can we use Mopes for this crime scene investigation? Well, the first one is metaphor. So you could use a metaphor like this. A snake of fear unfurled itself and writhed in the pit of my stomach. So instead of saying, you've got butterflies in your stomach, you've got a writhing snake in the pit of your stomach. And that's that metaphor. What about for onomatopoeia? Well, you could have something about the street and how it was busy. Screeching sirens wailed in the early morning as the rain hissed and spat around me. So you've got this idea of real noise, the screeching, the hissing, the spitting. Again, it's frightening and terrifying. So the onomatopoeia is adding that kind of exaggeration and hyperbolic feeling to the scene. Personification, well, you could personify the object that's been found. The object winked at me seductively. Its glittering metal was flashing me a bright, mischievous smile. It's almost kind of a very naughty kind of object that's trying to get attention. So you're personifying it as being seductive and mischievous. What about exaggeration? 10 million stormy thoughts crowded my head, which was a thunderstorm of rage. So you can see this over the top, hyperbolic language used to describe these thoughts, these stormy thoughts, a thunderstorm, again, going over the top. And then what about a simile? Well, going back to this pavement, you could say something like the crimson whirls were splattered on the curb like a modern art painting gone wrong. So this idea that it's been splattered and painting, there's so much blood that it's almost uncontrollable. Okay, so those are some mopes and ideas of mopes that you can use in your description of the crime scene. Now, we need to think about structuring for the last part of the webinar, structuring your descriptive writing. It's all very well thinking about sensory description, thinking about descriptive techniques, but how do you structure the piece as a whole? Well, one way you can do this is a box method, particularly if you've got a picture like this. You would divide the box up. They may not be equal squares, but you can see that we've got 4 squares, and we can start really thinking, right, how would I shape this? Where would I start? So we divide the picture up into squares. They may or may not be even. And then you number them and you say, right, where would I start? What would I start with? So number 1, let me start with a crime scene investigator. I'm going to be in his shoes. I'm going to decide that I'm that person feeling quite anxious and nervous about this crime scene. And then number 2, I'm going to describe the scene, the street. I can zoom into the street, and then number 3, I can zoom out and think about the surroundings and things in the crime scene behind. And then number 4, really zooming into the evidence. So using the box technique will really help just to decide, right, where do I start first? Where do I go next? What will be the next thing and how will I end? So it's very helpful to divide it up and to really think, right, where am I starting and where am I finishing? And again, if you're thinking about starting with a crime scene investigator, the description isn't just about the crime scene. The description is about the feelings, about the thoughts, about the imagination. You could even flash back to that crime scene investigator to a different kind of crime scene that might be contrasting or similar kind of fear. The street, you could actually describe the street itself where the crime scene investigator is, a little way down the street, different parts of the curb, when you're thinking about the surroundings, you could actually look at the gory aspects of the crime scene and think about, again, adding imagination, because we have to do that for descriptive writing. Maybe the dead body that's there in the scene that's been cordoned off, and then the evidence, that shiny metal object that the crime scene investigator seems to be looking at, describing the evidence, describing the thing itself, and also describing the significance and impact it may well have. So I hope that gives you an idea about using the box method. So what would that look like in your own writing? Well, it may look something like this in terms of 4 paragraphs. So you start with the crime scene investigator describing thoughts and feelings as they start, that sense of nervousness and anticipation. The grubby leaf-strewn pavement yawned ahead of me as I champed and crunched my way towards the vanilla shiny markers, crushing the jagged leaf-like leaves under my muddy boots. I slipped on the filmy, rubbery shoe covers, and I noticed this distinct odor of rotting flesh with an almost peppery tang. My cobalt rubber gloves coated my fingers in a warm, powdery substance that seemed to wriggle beneath my sharp fingernails. You're starting off with that perspective and what they're feeling and thinking as they enter the crime scene, getting ready, putting those protective layers on. And then the next part would be thinking about the street. So screeching sirens wailed in the early morning as the rain hissed and spat around me. So thinking about the street and thinking about where they are, and perhaps describing the pavement, describing the noises in the early morning. And then the third paragraph, perhaps the surroundings, and actually describing the dead body. No one could look at the scene. All eyes were instantly averted, and even experienced officers went pale and looked away. Red splodges stained the pavement, crimson whirls were splattered on the curb, dried scarlet blobs speckled the concrete, and even the grass was tinged with pink. Swollen and bruised toes poked awkwardly out of a battered shoe. A bloodied knee jutted at an impossible angle. Long matted locks wrapped a bruised neck like a hairy scarf. 2 black eyes stared impassively, but not seeing. So you're describing the surrounding, describing the dead body, and then describing the evidence, and of zooming in again to describe the evidence that the crime scene investigator actually finds. With precise and delicate hands and eager eyes, I examined the evidence in disbelief. Firmly, my stony fingers gripped the gravelly object as if it were the most precious item in the world. The object winked at me seductively. Its glittery metal was flashing me a brilliant, mischievous smile. So hopefully you can see with the box technique, because we've divided the picture up, we've thought about what to start with, where to go next, where to go next, where to go next. We've got a coherent and logical sequence. And with each of those paragraphs, we're trying to use AAA. So we're using as many adjectives and adverbs and alliterations as we can. We're trying to use mopes, metaphors, onomatopoeia, personification, exaggeration, and simile. And we're trying to use indirect description. So it's not really gory and brutal, but we can see that this is a horrible crime scene where no one wants to look at, and there's been a really violent action. And so hopefully the box technique helps you to structure, as well as using all the different techniques and the sensory description, to really have a powerful and effective piece. So overall, let's recap what we've looked at. So we've thought about auditory, visual, tactile, gustatory, and olfactory description, describing through the senses so it's vivid and we can almost feel as if we're there. Our readers can really feel as if we're in that crime scene. We've also looked at descriptive techniques like AAA, adjective, adverb, and alliteration, and mopes, metaphor, onomatopoeia, personification, exaggeration, and simile. We've also talked about show, don't tell, really making it exciting and descriptive and detailed rather than just blankly spelling something out and telling. And then we've also thought about the box technique to really think effectively about structuring and labeling and numbering so that we are creating a coherent and well-organized piece that fits together to really describe the crime scene. So you can have a go at your own writing. You can have a go at describing a crime scene using sensory description and descriptive techniques, and using the box technique to structure your work. I hope that this seminar has really helped you, and I hope that you can write an exciting and effective descriptive piece. Thank you for joining me.